Yes? Yeah. I'm doing something. I know, Bird. I know. Okay, can we wait? Cool. Yes. Yeah. We'll play after, okay, Birdie? Okay. Robert Andrew Berdella Jr. was an American serial killer between 1984 and 1987 in Kansas City, Missouri. He was known as the Kansas City Butcher and the Collector, since he would kidnap, brutally torture, and force his victims to endure up to 6 weeks of captivity. He would also dissect bodies like some kind of twisted science experiment before tossing them in the trash. My name is Charisse, and this is Arts and Crimes. Warning, the following story contains graphic murders and photographs and may not be safe for life. No, seriously guys, this gets seriously intense. I promise. I warned you ahead of time. Anyway, viewer discretion is advised. Robert Andrew Berdella Jr. was born on January 31st, 1949 in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, to Robert Berdella Sr. and Mary Berdella. His father worked in the Ford Motor Company as a die setter, while his mother was a homemaker. 7 years after Robert Jr. was born, the family welcomed his brother, Daniel. Apparently, the family was deeply religious, so they attended church regularly, which is nice. As a child, Robert Jr. was intelligent, but also a loner who rarely played outside his home. Like, he only just went to school. He didn't socialize or have any friends. He had a speech impediment and wore thick glasses from the age of 5 because he was severely nearsighted. When Robert reached puberty, he discovered that he was homosexual. Initially, he kept this fact a closely guarded secret, and he did not become open about his sexuality for several years. In 1965, Robert saw the film adaptation of the John Fowles book, The Collector. So the plot of this movie revolves around a man who stalks and abducts a young woman he finds attractive. He holds her captive in his windowless stone basement like a pervert creep, viewing her as little more than a specimen. Then after several weeks, the woman dies of a contracted illness, and despite her captor's efforts to keep her alive, she just died. It's not a fun story. Robert later stated this movie had formed a lasting impression on him. Like, seriously, dude, you need some Jesus in your life if that's who you're looking up to, but that's just my opinion. By the time he had reached his mid-teens, he had developed more self-confidence, which manifested itself in a condescending and ill-mannered attitude, especially towards women. However, to his credit, I guess, he did show a flair for showmanship, art, and cooking. Robert became extremely resentful and angry at his mother randomly. Well, not randomly, because she remarried soon after his father's unexpected death due to a heart attack on Christmas Day. But, like, gotta move on. No? I don't know. He started to spend more time doing solitary activities like painting, writing to pen pals, and stuff. Low-key feeling attacked here, but whatever. In 1967, Robert graduated high school, Cuyahoga Falls High School, and he had excellent grades all throughout, and he actually was placed in an independent study program in 1966. Good for you, Robert. Shortly after graduating high school, he then would relocate to Kansas City, Missouri. Fun fact: Kansas City is the 29th most populated metropolitan area in the U.S. Oh. Kansas City has over 200 fountains, giving it the nickname the City of Fountains. And lastly, did you know that Kansas City actually has more boulevards than Paris? Very important information giving you. Knowledge is power. I hope these help you in the future if anyone asks you about Missouri, Kansas. Wait, Kansas City, Missouri. Nailed it. You're welcome. So we're in Kansas, Missouri now, okay? You with me? Cool. Great. So he enrolled in the Kansas City Art Institute with aspirations of becoming a college professor. However, he ended up becoming a chef. During his college years, he would develop a trade known to exist in serial killers. He began to torture animals. While he was in school, art school, this douche indulged in animal torture on at least 3 occasions and was finally expelled in 1969 for killing a dog in an art experiment. What you doing there, Mr. Art Institute, sir? Like, why did it get that far? So let's fast forward to when he was 32 years old. He gave up on cooking and he set up a store called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar. Robert's store was selling antiques, jewelry, primitive art, all the stuff that he has been fascinated with since childhood. Now the store was only moderately profitable, so he had to scavenge or steal items to sell, basically. And he also ran like a little Airbnb thing at his house. Like he would take in lodgers, you know? Robert Berdella is believed to have killed his first victim on July 5th, 1984. His first victim was 19-year-old Jerry Howell. He was abducted after accepting a ride from Robert to attend a dancing contest. Robert then manipulated Jerry with alcohol, volume, and heavy sedatives both in his car and at his house until he became unconscious. Jerry was restrained to Robert's bed for a period of approximately 28 hours. Throughout this period of captivity, Robert repeatedly drugged, tortured, raped, and violated him with foreign objects, repeatedly ignoring Jerry's cries for help. So according to Robert, he said that Jerry either asphyxiated on his own vomit or the combination of the gag and the medicines were just too strong for him to be able to catch his breath. After a failed attempt at CPR on Jerry, Robert dragged his body to the basement. He then suspended Jerry's body above a large cooking pot and made several incisions to the inner elbows and jugular vein. Leaving the body suspended like this overnight allows the blood to drain from the corpse, like a butcher. Is that why they call him that? Oh. The following day, he dismembered Howell's body using a chainsaw and boning knives before wrapping the sections in newspaper and trash bags. Also like a butcher. Having a lot of realizations with this. These bags were placed inside larger bags, which Robert placed outside his house for a garbage crew to collect later on. Later questioned by officers who were investigating Jerry Howell's disappearance, Robert claimed to have driven Jerry to dance as promised, which is a lie. And then the two have parted ways after. Robert further claimed he had not seen him since. With all of Robert's murders, it's important to note he actually kept a detailed log. In this log, he would document all of his physical, sexual torture inflicted upon his victims. Robert wrote Jerry Howell had repeatedly pleaded for his ongoing abuse and torture to stop the entire time of his capture. Robert would either ignore these pleas, taunt Jerry, or just fully threatened him. His murderous rampage would continue. On April 10, 1985, 20-year-old Robert Sheldon, who was a former renter, arrived on his doorstep. Let's call him Sheldon, okay? He asked if he could once again stay at his house for a short period of time. And although Sheldon was responsible in paying rent, Robert considered him an inconvenience. And although he was not physically attracted to Sheldon, he still chose to drug and hold him captive on April 12th. Robert Berdella was adamant he held no hatred towards Sheldon, but he saw him as an individual who he could express some of the anger and frustration he had towards other people. Douche. Sheldon was drugged with sedatives and held captive in the second floor bedroom for 3 days. Now, poor Sheldon endured all forms of torture. Robert continuously sodomized him and even injected Drano into Sheldon's left eye. Just fucked up. Robert would also insert needles underneath his fingernails for just the thrill, I guess. He bound Sheldon's wrist with piano wire with the intention of permanently damaging the nerves in his hands. The torture continued. Oh yeah, it continued, with Robert filling Sheldon's ears with caulking. You know that stuff that's in your bathroom, like on the edge of the sink, that little rubbery stuff? Yeah, just stuff that's not supposed to go in your ear. Yeah, don't do that either. 3 days later, on April 15, a workman came to perform some scheduled work on the roof of Robert's house. This led Robert to think instantly, you know what? Time to kill Sheldon. So he placed a sack over his head and tied it with a piece of rope. Now get this. He later dissected Sheldon's body in the 3rd floor bathroom. For what reason? I have no idea. And then he dismembered the body. And for another weird reason, he kept Sheldon's head, I guess as a trophy. June 22nd comes around and there's a 20-year-old guy named Mark Wallace. Now, Robert knew Mark because Mark previously helped him with yard work, by the way. So anyways, at this time, Mark Wallace was hiding in Robert's tool shed because there was a thunderstorm happening and he just needed to seek some shelter. Robert invited him inside his house to keep dry. And then Robert noticed that Mark was a little tense and nervous, so he volunteered to inject him with chlorpromazine, as this would calm down and relax him. Mark willingly accepted this offer, and 30 minutes later, Robert decided to hold him captive. I'm not laughing, it's just, I'm very uncomfortable. Mark was then carried to the 2nd floor bedroom, and you know, the 2nd floor bedroom is where all the craziness happened. So Mark endured almost a day of torture and just agony. So while in captivity, some of the torture also included application of alligator clips to his chest. This would send electrical shocks through his body whenever Robert would see him losing consciousness, just to shock and wake him up. Mark Wallace then died through a combination of the drugs, the gag, and lack of oxygen. Robert noted his victim's time of death as being 7 p.m. on June 23rd, 1985. So you understand why I did a little more of a serious warning there in the beginning? This is why, because this would be just the beginning of Robert's evil deeds. Robert figured, hey, these past victims have been being a little too nice. Let's kick it up a notch. So he turned the volume all the way up in, metaphorically speaking. Yeah, that's the right thing, I think. On September 26, 1985, Robert received a phone call from another 20-year-old acquaintance. This guy was named James Ferris. James asked to stay at Robert's home for a short period of time, and of course Robert accepted. Robert had one motive and one motive only, and that, my friends, was just kidnapping James. They met at a bar that evening shortly after the phone call. So Robert brought James home and drugged him with crushed tranquilizers he had concealed inside a meal. Then he tied him to his bed before torturing him consistently for approximately 27 hours, dude. The torture included repeated electrical shocks that were over 7,000 volts to the shoulder and private parts for up to 5 minutes each time. Also included were, yet again, more acupuncture, but this time to the neck and to the genitals. Poor James gradually became delirious, like nodding in and out of consciousness. The poor guy, Robert didn't even stop there. Oh, no, he did not. Oh, he continued his sexual and physical assaults until he noted in his log that James was unable to sit up for more than 10 to 15 seconds. The next entry read, very delayed breathing. And then finally, Robert noted that James died with the slang term he used as a chef, 86. And if you ever watch Kitchen Nightmares like I do, you know that means to throw it out, stop the project, cancel the item. Right? I'm so sorry. This story sucks. Well, it's like a good story, but it's also like a sucky story. But it needs to be heard. You heard? Moving on. Todd Stoops was a 23-year-old drug addict and sometimes sex worker. Todd also had a wife, and twice they actually lived at Robert's house in the past in 1984. Robert didn't see him again until a chance encounter at the Kansas City Liberty Memorial Park on June 17, 1986. Of course, Robert invited him to his house with an offer of lunch and a little added incentive of some hanky-panky. Now, apparently, Robert was extremely physically attracted to Todd, and he was held captive for 2 weeks before he died. Robert was gradually increasing Todd's terror to make him a cooperative sex slave. Robert would use electrical shocks through Todd's eyelids in an attempt to blind him, and he also injected him with drain cleaner into his larynx to try and silence his screaming. Oh honey, he doesn't stop there. So during the second week of his capture, Todd asked Robert for a soft drink and a sandwich, which is very brave to ask, I would just ask for some water. I know, that's not the point. I don't know. That's just like a really big thing to ask for someone that's like a dick. Well, Robert refused, and Todd burst into tears. On June 27, 1986, Robert ruptured Todd's rectum with his fist. You heard me right. This caused severe bleeding and discharge, which turned into an infection. Towards the end of Todd's captivity, Robert tried to feed him ice cream and soup. Unfortunately, though, he wasn't even able to keep anything down. So by the final day of his captivity, Todd was just so weak. Later, Robert stated that he was unable to breathe in a sitting up position. On July 1st, Todd Stoops passed away. A forensic pathologist later testified that the infected, ruptured rectum caused septic shock, which proved fatal. Ugh. In the spring of 1987, Robert became friendly with a 20-year-old man named Larry Wayne Pearson. This casual friendship began when Larry entered his shop and explained to Robert that as a child, he held an interest in both witchcraft and wizardry. And that's just adorable. Larry had temporarily lodged with Robert and willingly performed chores around his home as a means of paying rent, because he was a good person. According to Robert, he actually didn't intend to hold Larry captive. But because Robert is like a bottle of evil soda that's been shaken and is ready to pop, he decided to form a plan to keep Larry on June 23rd. Coincidentally, that day, Robert had to bail Larry out of jail. I think Larry was robbing men in Wichita or something. I don't exactly know. It's not important. Anyways, that evening, Robert made sure Larry became intoxicated before injecting him with chlorpromazine and moving him down to his basement. God, this really is a house of horrors, isn't it? Robert then bound Larry's hands above his head, then linked the rope to a brick column, and then he injected Larry's throat with drain cleaner as well. He then brought that electrical transformer to the basement. I guess this was his favorite toy. Robert said Larry was by far the most cooperative of his 6 murder victims. By the 5th day of his captivity, Larry endured horrible torture, such as repeated electrical shocks with that transformer thing, and Robert even broke several hand bones with an iron rod to render him submissive. So anyway, Robert thought that Larry earned his trust, so as a form of a reward, Larry was moved to the 2nd floor. Aw, that's not a reward at all. Robert said that if he continued to cooperate, he would not continue to inflict as much pain upon him as he had done so while he was in the basement. Throughout the end of his 6 weeks of captivity, Larry started to train himself to sleep without moving. He did this so he wouldn't cause himself pain from the torture, thus inviting Robert to inflict further torture on him. Great. There's no win here. You either lose or you lose in French. After a whole 6 weeks of captivity, Larry bravely and deeply bit into Robert's wiener. Larry demanded he could not continue to tolerate being treated in this manner. Good for you, Larry. But Robert took in what Larry was saying. Robert then walked away for a sec, and then he came back with a tree limb, which he then used to bludgeon Larry into unconsciousness. He then suffocated him with a bag, and that was it. Larry was dead. Afterward, Robert drove himself to the hospital to receive treatment for his wounded pecker. Robert went home to Larry's body, then dismembered him in the basement. And his head, he initially stored in a plastic bag in the freezer, but Robert would later bury it in his backyard. What are you doing with the heads, Robert? Who hurt you, Robert? So we reached our final victim. And this ends a little differently, so hold tight, okay? On March 29, 1988, Robert abducted his last victim, a 22-year-old sex worker named Christopher Bryson. Now, he lured Chris to his house upon the promise of payment for some hanky-panky. I say hanky-panky because my parents watch this. And yeah, you know what I'm talking about. It's weird. That's what I'm trying to say. Sex. At Robert's home, Chris was knocked unconscious with an iron bar. Then he was bound to the bed. He was subjected to similar methods of abuse and torture, the torture endured by previous victims. Although, in Christopher's case, Robert repeatedly swabbed his eyes with ammonia. Why the eyes so much? Like, there's so much eye stuff. Robert said to Chris, "The only thing you need to think about are you, me, and this house." Just a little fucked up if you ask me. Therese, the whole thing is fucked up. After several days, Robert explained to Chris that he began to trust his captive, and that although he was willing to discuss lesser methods of the abuse and torture he was receiving, he was adamant that there would be no negotiations to the intensity of his sexual abuse. Robert should not open a carnival or anything. Like, there's gonna be a game, like at this carnival thing. Do you want to drink piss, or do you want to drink piss mixed with hot dog water? You literally lose either way. Robert finished his discussion with a stern warning. He said, "I've gotten this far with other people before, and they're dead now because of the mistakes they've made." By the third day of his capture, Chris had earned sufficient trust from Robert to persuade him to establish a daily routine of tying his hands in front of him rather than above his head. His excuse was that when they were above his head, it was restricting the circulation to his arms. Surprisingly, Robert agreed. He also got Robert to leave a television on within the room and asked that the remote control be placed between his legs whenever Robert would leave for work. And Robert, being such a nice and reasonable guy, he agreed to that as well. How kind of him. The following day, Robert left the house to go to work. What's weird is that these guys have jobs. Chris managed to break free of his restraints by burning through them using a book of matches. Turns out, Robert left the matches in the room and luckily within Chris's reach. Chris then managed to escape from the house by jumping from the second floor window, wearing absolutely nothing besides a dog collar around his neck. He unfortunately would break a bone in his foot in the process, but I mean, he would leave with his life. He then ran towards a meter officer walking across the other side of the street, and he was frantically shouting for them to call the police. This individual led Chris to a house he had been approaching, and the occupants promptly called the police. The police then arrived just minutes later, thank God. I have a question though. Was he still naked at this point? Is no one gonna give him some pants? I know it's not important. So he was questioned at the scene by 4 police officers, and he said that Robert had kept him tied to his bed at this house, and throughout much of the time he was held against his will, repeatedly being sodomized, drugged. He got like drain cleaner injected into his throat, so he couldn't even speak loudly. As Chris spoke, the officers noted that in addition to the dog collar and broken foot, he had inflamed red swollen eyes and infected visible scars and welts across his entire body. Oh, okay, so he is naked at this point. Okay. I ask such stupid questions, but at least I got the answer. 2 officers were told to maintain a discreet surveillance of the property, Robert's property, and Chris was driven to the Menorah Medical Center accompanied by an officer. He had to get treatment. The last officer radioed the Kansas City Police Department to request a search warrant of the property. Later questioned in greater detail at the police department, Christopher said he had been held against his will, like he said, by the occupant of 4315 Charlotte Street. He also told police that Robert had showed him a number of Polaroid images of men who appeared to be dead. Later, Robert had informed him he had no intention of ever allowing him to leave his property, and that he claimed to have killed the previous individuals he had captured and treated in this exact manner, and that if Chris became a nuisance or a threat to him, he would either be subjected to greater levels of torture than whatever he was already enduring, or simply be killed. Finally, on the charges of sexual assault towards Christopher Bryson, he declined to allow any officers inside his home, but luckily, the search warrant earlier requested was already drafted to search his property. So they were like, "Fuck you, Robert," and helped themselves inside. The officers were corroborating Chris's claims of having been restrained and tortured in the second floor bedroom. So they walk up, doop, 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 doop. The investigators discovered the bedroom on the second floor. They found the burnt ropes attached to the post at the foot of the bed. Also in the room was the electrical transformer plugged right into the wall with wires leading to the bed. A metal tray containing syringes, small bottles apparently containing prescription drugs, swabs, eye drops were also close to the bed. Also found in the room was that long iron pipe, bunch of rope, leather belts, and a partridge in a pear tree. Investigators also noted that posts on the bed have been extensively worn, suggesting that the restraints had earlier been tied to these posts and the individual or individuals had struggled to free themselves, those poor people. Elsewhere in the house and grounds of Charlotte Street, investigators uncovered a human skull inside a closet on the second floor. They also found a partially decomposed human head in the backyard. Gross. Can you imagine just seeing these things? Like, that's not great. The search also uncovered several human spinal cords, and these spinal cords were scarred by a hacksaw, because he dismembered them and was a little sloppy, I guess. There were several human teeth stowed away in 2 envelopes in the hallway. Both a hacksaw and a miter saw, whatever the saw. It was also found, and a chainsaw was found covered in bloodstains, flesh, and pubic hairs. Luminol tests revealed that the floor of Robert's basement and 2 plastic trash barrels were extensively bloodstained. Can you imagine the smell? Actually, don't. I don't want to know what it is, but I'm sure it was very, very heavy. Anyway, a whopping 334 Polaroid pictures of various male individuals were also found stored in various locations throughout the house. These pictures showed Christopher Bryson and several other men, both in life and in death. Many of the images had been taken as the subjects had been tortured. The search also uncovered numerous restraints, sexual devices, porno magazines, hypodermic needles, a book on narcotics, and just all that. On top of a dresser, police discovered a notepad showing the detailed logs of each victim. They found 37 newspaper clippings from the Kansas City Star regarding a missing young man named Jerry Howell. Both a wallet and a driver's license belonging to a missing person named James Ferris, which was discovered also in the closet. So basically, mountains and mountains of evidence. Good job, police. Good job. Robert Berdella was formally charged with 1 count of felony restraint, 1 count of assault, and 7 counts of forcible sodomy. This was just the beginning of the charges, since investigators continued their search throughout the property and they would make more discoveries. So later on, they would add further charges against him. He was assigned a temporary public defender and held in protective custody in a Jackson County jail. Robert was held on $500,000 bail, which is about a lot in today's money. In late April, the skull found inside Robert's closet was identified with dental x-rays belonging to Robert Sheldon. The same day, 2 different men phoned the Kansas City PD to state one of the 7 unidentified men in the Polaroids was a former acquaintance of theirs named Mark Wallace. When detectives contacted Mark Wallace's sister, she said that she hasn't seen him since mid-1985. Shortly after, investigators discovered that the photograph with a letter D written on it, well, this was of Larry Wayne Pearson. As Larry had once been arrested in Wichita, remember when he got bailed out by Robert? Well, his dental records were discovered and compared to the skull found in the backyard. On July 22nd, 1988, a grand jury formally charged Robert for the murder of Larry Wayne Pearson. The following month, he pled guilty to the first-degree murder of Larry. A second guilty plea submitted before the Jackson County Court on August 24th earned Robert a further life term without parole for one charge of forcible sodomy against Christopher Bryson, the guy that escaped. Despite initially pleading not guilty to the remaining 5 murder charges, Robert Berdella ultimately conducted a plea bargain with the prosecutors to avoid the death penalty. In this plea bargain, Robert agreed to confess in graphic detail to whom he had killed, what indignities he had subjected each victim to, how he killed each victim, and what he had done with their bodies. These confessions were given to prosecutors between December 13 and December 15, 1988. In return for his cooperation, the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty. On December 19, 1988, Robert formally pleaded guilty to each of the charges. In response to these guilty charges, Judge Myers gave Robert 5 further life sentences, with an additional condition of any future parole. Yay. It's not the death penalty, but I guess the victims' families got some kind of justice, right? For their loved ones. I don't know. It all sucks either way. Just the whole thing sucks. Just because of one person. In 1992, Robert Berdella contacted a counselor of his distress because staff at the Missouri State Penitentiary were withholding his heart medication. Boo-hoo! Must be torture. Later in 1992 at 2 p.m. on October 8, to be exact, Robert complained to prison staff of having heart pains, and he was taken from his cell to the prison infirmary. Medical staff determined his heart was unable to be stable, so they called an ambulance. Robert was then taken to a hospital in Columbia, Missouri, where he was pronounced dead. Oh, that's horrible. But still, don't come for me. Anyways, he was pronounced dead from a heart attack at 3:55 p.m. Boop, boop. He was 43 years old. Get over it, Robert. All right, let's talk about the aftermath. So according to published reports, he was diagnosed a sexual sadist who gained extreme sexual excitation. He got a hard-on for people that he hurt. And not to be rude, but no shit. He never expressed any remorse for his actions. He referred to his victims as playthings or play toys during an interview before his death. Robert Berdella's House of Horrors was purchased by a local businessman for an undisclosed sum in December of 1988. Why? I don't know why. The property was later demolished. So get this. By the time of his arrest, he had abducted and tortured at least 6 young men. But the Kansas City PD believed that he was involved with more. Oh yeah, also, there was more than 20 different men looking unconscious or dead that are not identified in those 334 Polaroid images. Who are these guys? But Robert was adamant that those 6 individuals that were identified were the only ones that he killed. What do you guys think about that? I think that's a lie. Duh, but that's my opinion.
People are of no value. We could make more sometimes if we need them.
I remember obviously fuckers trying to fucking hate on me. I show fuck with people shit and leave the bad and you can leave the blood on my side. You get a sacrifice. 12 o'clock is when I'm back is evil fucking and I double flip in the dirty action of the night. Yes, you're ridiculous to the side, but I feel my life all losing nigga. See my bitches on me, but I'm forgetting what this is like. Free when the fight, free spinning the me from razor strike, and it might be genuine, no bitch, heavy, oh, do my name, I'm
So that's the case of the Kansas City butcher. A total waste of space, a toasted piece of poop with a fork in it, an absolute dumpster fire, hangnail, pus bag, a complete... Here's a puppy dancing. Dance, 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 dance. I like to dance with my puppy. Please like and comment and subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed this video and also hate Robert Berdella. It would be a great honor to my family if you did. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Say bye, Charlie. Bye, Charlie.